The African slave trade. Much of the so-called African slave trade was fabricated and widely exaggerated. There was no trade. An independent source showing that the so-called Indians on the eastern seaboard, also called Terra Nova, were Moors, is called the book African and Native Americans by Jack D. Forbes. He shows in the book how many so-called Native American Indians were sold into slavery in Africa and Europe. This is the opposite direction in which we were taught the slave trade went. These Native Americans or Indians were classified as Negroes and blacks in the slave books of Seville, Spain and elsewhere. On page 29 he says, and I quote, "Slaves from Terra Nova show up in the slave markets of Seville and Valencia very soon after 1500. For example, in Valencia during the period to 1516, we find in 1503 Miguel Man, in 1505 Juan and Pedro, and in 1507 Antonio and Juan Amarco. In 1515 Ali, now Melchor, and in 1516 Catalina. They were all classified as Negroes." Unquote. Now, think about this. If we were first brought to North America around 1619, or even as early as 1555 for that matter, then how were they taking slaves from Newfoundland to Europe, all before 1520? Keep in mind that one of the Native Americans even had the name Ali, and all were classified as Negroes once they reached Valencia. How did a Native American in 1515 have a Moorish name, Ali? At least 3,000 Americans, so-called Indians, are known to have been shipped to Europe between 1493 and 1501, the Columbus expeditions, with the likely total possibly double that. Most were sent to the Seville area, where they seem to show up in the slave markets as Negroes. These are major contradictions to the whole slave trade myth. Blacks were always in America. The missing Indians are Negroes. The slaves sold on the slave markets in the South were initially the black people from right here in this hemisphere. As they took the lands here, they enslaved the inhabitants of those lands who were black. The tens of millions of Americans, so-called Indians, who disappeared after 1492 did not all die in the Holocaust inflicted within America. Many thousand were sent to Europe and Africa as slaves. The whole slave trade myth is that the whole story was given to us in reverse. A mass colony of Africans were not shipped from Africa to America, but the truth is that black Indians were shipped from America to Europe. They were then shipped from Spain to Africa as a commodity for African resources. These black Indians, now mistaken as Africans, were shipped back to America and classified as African slaves. This part of our history is what the school systems failed to mention in their history programs. Am I saying that there was no slave trade? There was indeed a kidnapping of Africans from Africa to America. However, it was the result of the mass shipment and slaughter of the Moors in America at the hands of the Columbus expeditions. Columbus's first journey in 1492 was a mission to capture gold, but he was sidetracked by the presence of the black Moors. Columbus sent the word back to the monarchs of Spain that they were what he referred to in his logs as the people of the Queen of Sheba. Columbus kidnapped Arawak Indians along with gold nuggets, exotic birds, and grain. Queen Isabella provided Columbus with 17 ships, 1,500 men, cannons, crossbows, guns, and attack dogs for the second voyage. Columbus's new mission was to conquer the West. When Columbus returned to the West, Haiti, and South America in 1493, he not only took raw materials and resources, but he abducted women. After a short time, the Arawaks resisted Columbus, and on March 25, 1495, Columbus slaughtered thousands of Arawak native men, women, and babies. Columbus also rounded up 1,500 Arawaks and shipped them to Spain. Columbus became the first man known in history to send the first slaves across the Atlantic. Other nations rushed to emulate Columbus. In 1501, the Portuguese began to depopulate the pt.1 Indians to Cape Verde as slaves. The Black Indian slavery destroyed the Indian nations of Natchez, the Yamasee, and the Pequots. Because of this, the first African slave raid took place in 1505 and was spearheaded by Columbus's son. When the Moors, the Indians, of America began dying and committing suicide, the labor was replaced with slaves from the Sahara in West Africa. Also, the gold and silver that Columbus extracted from America fueled a 400% inflation that eroded the economies of the non-European nations and helped Europe to develop a global market system. Africa suffered a great economical blow. The trans-Saharan trade collapsed because America supplied more precious gems than the African West Coast. African traders now only had one commodity that Europe wanted: slaves. African sultans thus sold their own black people into slavery to whites. It is safe to say that Columbus is solely responsible for slavery of the Moors, from west to east and from east to west. This is the bottom of an African slave ship. These were called big bottoms as they were constructed to hold hundreds of Africans packed like sardines. These trips from Africa to America took up to 3 to 4 months from east to west. According to history, these hundreds of Africans urinated and defecated on themselves during the journey. Now come on, 4 months of constant urination and defecation? These slaves would have literally drowned. Does this story really make sense? The Dogons were already on American land because they simply sailed over by way of the worldwide wind and currents.